Changeworking, moving minds for change that lasts.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Changeworking, a show for practitioners and coaches who help their clients create change. My name is Ruckus, and as always, I'll be in conversation with James Tripp. Today, we're talking about curiosity, both from the practitioner and the client during a Changework session, and if having more curiosity creates a better session. So here we go. This is my conversation with James about curiosity.
I'm kind of big on curiosity, and part of that is because going back to my original training and my original influences, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, they were big on curiosity. Now, whether they were big on curiosity because Erickson was big on curiosity, or whether they were independently curious, I assume they're independently curious. But whether they had curiosity as an explicit value before working with Erickson, I don't know. But Erickson was very curious, and I do think there's a profound power in curiosity because, number one, curiosity is mutually exclusive to fear and reactivity. Right? Now, fear and reactivity are not good. They are not good. I'm going to call them energies, but I mean that metaphorically. They're not good energies for change because they have people sort of locked down and grasp for certainties and these sorts of things. So if you can get somebody to step away from reactivity and fear, and I mean even if they're looking at their own thoughts and thinking. So a lot of people, they don't even want to go near their own thoughts because they're afraid of their thoughts. They can't be curious about them. They're afraid of them. They think, what does it mean about me that I think these things? You know, either this thing is true and it's a terrible thing, or it's just a thought that I'm having and therefore I'm dysfunctional for having this thought or something like that. So people are not good witnesses to their own processes. And being a good witness to your own process, I believe, is the profoundly useful thing for change. I'm not saying it's the only thing that leads to change, but it's impossible to witness something if you're afraid of it, if you're fearful of what it might mean, if you see it and see it clearly. So curiosity, I think, is in part an antidote to that. Now, the question is, what comes first, the curiosity or the ability to be with something without reacting to it? Maybe if we're afraid of something, we can't really be curious about it. And it's only when we drop the fear we can be curious. Maybe inviting curiosity dispels fear to some degree. I don't know. But I do think it's very, very important from that perspective. I also think that curiosity and creativity go together. An example of that is when we were having the conversation the other day and I mentioned the watchtower at the St. Cuthbert's Church, where they would look out for the grave diggers. They'd have a security guard up in the watchtower looking out for the grave diggers or the grave robbers. And immediately you were curious about that. Your curiosity switched on as part of maybe that could be an interesting idea in a story or something like that. So, if you were not curious about that, you couldn't really be creative, I wouldn't think. So I think curiosity sort of drives exploration, and exploration is connected with growth and learning and change and these kinds of things. So I do really, truly believe it's a powerful asset or resource when it comes to change work.
Yeah, I was even struggling what to call it, but I think resource is a great way to think about it. I'm curious. Even
Yeah,
I start sentences like that, and it just sounds like I'm being cheeky. I'm actively avoiding using the word curious right now.
I think you should just let go.
I just start every sentence with it because I wouldn't be asking you these questions if I wasn't curious about your answer.
And that's why curiosity is so generative. A genuinely curious person. And you talked about change work. If I'm genuinely curious as to how this person is organizing their reality, which I am when I'm doing change work, that drives the sort of detective mind. It drives the creative mind. If you're just not curious, but you're going, well, I'm going through the checklist of information gathering. Well, how can you do anything with that? How can you make any connections for yourself that might be generative if you're not even curious? I don't know how that could be done. I could say curiosity is the antidote to fear because they're mutually exclusive states. But I could easily say fear is the antidote to curiosity. Right? I know that doesn't make sense because of how we valence these things. But they're kind of mutually exclusive. So I wonder to what degree the fear that can come up for practitioners actually shuts off their curiosity. Because it's impossible to be curious if you are caught up in any kind of what Albert Ellis would call masturbatory thinking. I absolutely must not get this wrong. I must not screw this up. I must do a good job with this client. And this is one of the reasons why there's a paradox in this. I'm always advocating when people do change work is to let go of an outcome attachment, reduce excess importance for yourself and for the client. The more desperation there is to change, the more neediness, the more the threat response systems are kicking off all the time, and the less curiosity can be brought to the table. So as a practitioner, there's this paradox, particularly if you're doing it professionally and you start getting paid and you go, right, I want to deliver a good job here. It would be absolutely terrible if this person paid me and didn't get the change they want. Well, if you're operating from a paradigm like that, then your threat response systems are going to kick off. And that's going to shut down your curiosity. And that's one of the primary assets, primary resources that you have to do the work. On the flip side of it, the client wants that asset. They want that resource. And if they're like, well, I've paid this money and I've got to get value for money and all of this, it's one of the reasons why, a lot of coaches say, if people don't pay, they're not invested. I don't buy that, actually. Right? I really don't, because I work with a lot of people who get my services, I get paid, but they don't pay. It's free at the point of delivery because their employer pays or somebody else pays. But what is true is they're desperate. And I have never found it to be a problem that they've not paid. In fact, I think to a certain degree, it unhooks them from a neediness to get absolute results right now. And weirdly, actually works better. So I think I do better change work in aggregate when people are not paying, which is the opposite of what most people will say, certainly in the world of coaching and this kind of thing. But I do think that when people are unhooked from that neediness, right, and this is useful to recognize. One of my favorite lines that I will deploy when doing change work, and I deploy this when I sense any kind of resistance or struggle or bunching up or anything like that. Maybe the client's holding their breath a lot. They're struggling. Something doesn't seem right. I'll often say at that point, there's no rule in the universe that says you have to change anything here today. And a number of times I've seen people's body release, they sigh. Even people who are paying, because some of my clients are paying me directly, but people have always got that ambivalence around change. I always say if they had no ambivalence around change, they wouldn't need to hire a changework practitioner. They would just be off and flying. But there's usually some ambivalence, some resistance somewhere within the system, some parts, you could say, that are invested in the status quo or whatever it will be, some attachment to a cherished truth or something like that. There's usually some kind of ambivalence. So when you can unhook people from that, you can have release, let go, and be in a place of exploration. I remember seeing a quote once, so I think I pulled it out of a book, and I can't remember. I think it might have been called Ending the Pursuit of Happiness, and I can't think of what the author was, but I could be completely wrong about that. And it said something like, the first and most important step to change is to just stop and look and witness. But if you're in too much of a hurry to change, you cannot stop and look and witness. So this sort of desperation, this neediness can be a real barrier. I need to get this right now. I haven't got time to look at that. I haven't got time. Can't you just hypnotize me? So I think these are all kind of dynamics in the mix. And I'll just say this while we're talking about these things. Often when people get into change work, they're looking at processes or techniques or protocols or whatever. And most of what makes stuff work is contextual variance, right? The context that the process is deployed in. Now, the context isn't just what room, what's the contract or anything like that. The context is the unspoken beliefs, truths, attachments, needs, needinesses, all of these sorts of things. They all create the context. One of the beautiful things about more classical hypnosis is it slows everything down, right? It's difficult to be needy and desperate when you're moving slowly. It's tricky. So it kind of unhooks people from that grabbiness, those attachments, these kind of things, because everything is slowing down. There's more space between things. There's an unhurried quality. If you look at the way Erickson would often do trance work, he'd go through this. There's no need for you to do anything right now. You don't have to close your eyes or relax deeply. There's nothing that needs to happen apart from being here now. That's unhooking from attachments. It's unhooking from neediness. As is, there's no rule in the universe that says you have to change anything. So this all creates a space where people can start to be with stuff they have been reacting to. And that's a major thing. If you can't be with something, how can you relate to it in a transformative way?
And when you're saying fear and curiosity are mutually exclusive, just so I want ultimate clarity on this, you mean the moment you start to feel a certain amount of fear, you don't have access to curiosity anymore?
If I say that's the case, somebody will go, no, I don't believe that's so, because there was this one time where I saw this rat and I was absolutely terrified, but strangely curious at the same time, or something like that. So,
right.
Someone will say that.
Right.
And it might be possible to be utterly terrified and strangely curious at the same time. I'm not saying it isn't possible.
Okay.
But I think that when that is the case, it's almost a bit like I can put my hand in a bucket of hot water and my other hand in a bucket of cold water, and I could go, well, I'm in hot and cold water at the same time. But
yeah,
do you see what I mean? It's a weird, unusual contrivance that had to happen to make that happen. So
sure.
But generally, I think it's true to say they're mutually exclusive.
So the reason I was asking that is if you have a client, you're in a session and you see that they're in a fear trance or state, or they're just feeling a lot of fear, just leading them towards curiosity would naturally depotentiate the fear, or would you try to work on depotentiating the fear and that would open up curiosity? Are those two different approaches, or are they the same thing to you?
I'll tend to just pace and lead towards a better working state. So, it's just like what needs to happen. There's a certain amount of acknowledgement that needs to happen, a certain amount of empathetic witnessing to their current experience. And then it's a matter of leading. Now, the way I lead a lot, and I suspect this is the way that Erickson would lead a lot, is I'll lead a lot non-verbally. So I will slow myself down, I'll release my body, and I will switch on curiosity within myself, right? So, but you might also say, for the time that we're here today, there's nothing else that needs to happen other than for us to be here. So even things like that, there's nothing that needs to be attended to. This is Erickson's not knowing, not doing principle. All is well and all will be well, right? Just for this time. So there's a vibe that I might want to evoke. Now, sometimes I might even say to people directly, as you say that, you seem kind of tense, and I'll tense up to mirror them. And they'll go, yes. I'll say, and that probably doesn't feel good, right? And they go, yes. So building a yes set. And it's entirely understandable why you might be feeling this way. Right? And I'm going to start to loosen it slightly. Right? And I'll say, you might want to notice your breathing a little bit more. Or something, anything. It's just pacing and leading. A lot of it's non-verbal. I'm trying to make an explicit example there, but much of it's done purely non-verbally.
So I was wondering about clients that, I'm just talking about natural curiosity of a client. And are there, I know you like to think in terms of sometimes of gambit. So if you have a client that you have a feeling isn't being particularly curious about themselves and you want to open that up and engender that within them for the purposes of getting this session going, do you have a gambit for curiosity, or do you have some steps?
Well, funnily enough, even I'm doing the whole thing right now, and I just realized this is an audio, so nobody can see what I'm doing.
Right.
So there's a way that I'm going to be like, I'm going to do this kind of pantomime of curiosity about things. I think this is a reasonably common thing that quite a lot of therapists do, whether it's conscious or not. Not that I consider myself a therapist as such.
For the audience, he's putting his hand on his chin, like stroking it. Like,
Yeah, it's like,
yeah.
That's kind of interesting. I'll say that sort of thing. That's kind of interesting. And I'm sort of like doing this sort of pantomime of like, I'm seeing something here that I'm curious about. Right now, I'm not going to rush in and say that because I want them to hook into my vibe of curiosity. And also, that's something that I call a curiosity hook. So a curiosity hook in that if you go, that's kind of interesting. And it's like you're going to make an observation, but you don't jump to make the observation. You leave an amount of time. So you want some inner processing for the person to go, what? What's he going to say? Right? So when you leave these curiosity hooks, so like sometimes I'll just stop and I go, and I go to like, I'm going to say something and then I deliberately stop myself and I'm thinking and I'm reflecting on it and they're waiting. What's he going to say? What's he going to do? Right? That is a way of evoking curiosity. Right? You can do it in any kind of way. Sometimes I'll go, oh, like I've just suddenly had a surprising thought. Right? And they're like, and it'll hook somebody in a little bit. So there's that kind of thing. A lot of this is done with nonverbals. It could be done with verbals as well, because you could more explicitly, in a more left hemisphere way, say, have you ever been profoundly curious about something? You could say that, right? And maybe they have, maybe they haven't. That's a bit more of a kind of left hemisphere gambit rather than the right hemisphere gambit. I prefer those right hemisphere gambits largely. Here's a little bit of business that you can do. You can completely change direction because often someone's caught up in their problem. They're caught up in their reaction sets. If you can't pace and lead straight out, you can ask them a question like, so I'm curious, where were you born? And their mind floats back to the very beginning of their life, which is, of course, way before this problem happened. Right. So they're going to float back and say, where were you born? Were you born at home or in a hospital? Right? People don't tend to remember too much about when they're born because that kind of curiosity about the world just starts to emerge at a very young age. But and you can sort of pace him from that point because kids are naturally curious. They do want to find out about things. They don't necessarily know they know they don't know how things are, right, on a deep unconscious level. So they're massively curious about the world. So you can shift out to that kind of place, So there are lots of sort of gambits. A lot of this comes down to this idea of, is the client in a good working state? Are they in a good, resourceful state? Are they able to bring a variety of different qualities of attention to their problem material? Or are they just locked in the same reaction that they have over and over again? Right? One little hypothetical I love to ask is there a recurring problem that you have in your life? Most people go, yes, there's something. And when that problem comes up, do you meet that in a variety of different ways? Or do you always meet it in the same way? Right? Now, vast majority of people don't realize it, but the truth is they always meet it in the same way.
Right.
And that's an example, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, of somebody not witnessing their own processes. They don't even realize that they always meet that in the same way. But the thing about that as a little piece, or as a gambit, if you like, is it actually indirectly presupposes that you could meet it in a variety of different ways without demanding that you should. So it just starts to open up the envelope of possibility a little bit more.
Yeah, because suddenly as you were saying that, I was imagining myself as a client with a problem, and it brought back to what you said earlier about witnessing your process. Suddenly, I was witnessing my process of the way. Oh, I am approaching that challenge the same way, and suddenly I'm like, well, how else could I approach that?
Right.
And I suddenly became a witness to the process. Just when you saying that little
right.
That's a beautiful little gambit, I think.
So that's an example of, what I often call a gambit. It's just a little piece. It's a bit of business. It's not going to be, I said these words to this client and they were suddenly free from being bothered by their tinnitus. I'm not saying that's what happens, but everything's about facilitating process much of the time, and you're thinking about what are the mind shifts that I'm looking to get. So that one encourages a dissociation. It directs attention by shifting where the attention is paid from inside of the problem to outside of the problem, a witnessing to the process, but also the seeding of the idea that there are other possibilities here, that it isn't necessarily just that it always needs to be one way or whatever. And subtly seeding that you are an agent in this and you have agency in this without saying, you're doing this. Why don't you do something different? That would be a clumsy way of seeding the idea that you've got agency. But by saying, I'm curious, when this problem comes up, do you meet this in a variety of different ways? There's the seeding of the semantic idea, or always in, roughly the same way?
It's so beautiful. Like, I'm struck with how beautiful that is. This is what I get so excited about hypnotic communication and the language behind it, because if you were wanting to help, just hang out with your friend and they have this problem and you present something like that, you're generally just asking them a question. They're not like, hey, he's doing hypnosis on me, or he's trying to change me or anything. If you really have a curiosity and you really want the answer to that, but that suddenly opens that up inside of them, and suddenly they're witnessing their own process. I'm so struck with how beautiful that is in such a simple one beautiful little question that could literally change something for someone.
Right. And it can. This is the thing about these little things, these bits of business. Sometimes you drop a little gambit like that and it has a huge impact just in and of itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes it just moves things a little bit, but it usually gets some movement. If it has a huge impact in and of itself and somebody's like, I might say to them at that point, something just changed. What's happened? Right? If I see a big shift and then they're going to tell me, and then that can be leveraged back into the unfolding system. But there's another thing I want to say about this, because I tend to think about these things in terms of conversational hypnosis or whatever. And someone will go, well, you're just talking to somebody.
Right.
But there's an awareness of process underneath of the talking to. Right? It's beyond just trying to communicate some information. It's intentionally and strategically looking to create a perspective shift and an experience shift. So for me, that's what makes a conversational hypnosis rather than just like, well, we're just talking, because it's strategic.
Right. But this is beautiful because I think about, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I'm kind of obsessed with these little bits of conversation that you can have. I think about like standing in a line at the bank, talking to a stranger, if you're the type of person who, and you could, if they happen to, people like to complain to strangers, if you notice this, but just that, if you employed that little bit there, just that little game, and that was the entire conversation, but it just got them thinking about it. Like that could very well make a huge difference in their life if you never talk to them again.
Right.
I'm just obsessed with those little bits like that. I love that so much. I know I've heard you talk before about back to curiosity and specifically Erickson. I've heard you tell the story before. Maybe you can remember what it is, or maybe it was a common thing you said, but someone, can you help me with X? And he would say, I don't know, but would you give me that whole sentence again? Because I love it so much.
So Erickson would generally respond. Someone would say, Dr. Erickson, can you help me stop smoking? And he would say, I don't know, but I am curious to find out what's possible for you. Right. Now, I know this, or I have been told this by Stephen Gilligan. Now, Stephen Gilligan is, he was very close to Erickson, spent a lot of time with Erickson. Stephen Gilligan is the closest thing to the embodiment of Erickson who's alive today. And he did the whole NLP modeling thing, because Gilligan was originally part of the original NLP crew before defecting to go all in with Erickson. So you really get a sense of how Erickson did this when you hear Steve Gilligan deliver it. And it's with this smile and this twinkle in the eye and this deep, profound, magical fascination. It just gets all conveyed in the non-verbals. So I am curious to find out what's possible for you. Right now, if you think about that principle that I was saying earlier, it doesn't serve to have the client overly attached to a specific outcome and desperate for it. So even with a move like that, I am curious to find out what's possible. It's not like, right, let's see if we can get this change made. right? It's a completely different energy. It's a completely different background. It opens up a completely different playing field and invites somebody in. Now, that's really early on in the communication. Like if somebody did turn around and say, well, that's no good, I want some guarantees. Well, they're probably going to walk, but they probably wouldn't at that point. Now, by the way, I just want to say something about this, because when I first was learning NLP, I was told by my trainers that I ought to always convey with absolute certainty to my clients that we were going to get the change they wanted. And I never felt comfortable with that because, you see, I can't predict the future and they can't predict the future. And we don't even know what the appropriate future is for them yet. And I think it's really interesting that Erickson didn't do that. He didn't feel the need to do that. Now, the reason I was told that I must do that is because if I didn't do that, I would seem unsure, right? And therefore I would lose rapport because I would be uncertain. I get what's being said there, but Erickson is not uncertain. He's not uncertain in his energy, in his vibe, in his being. He's very grounded in his being. He is completely certain that he doesn't know, and that's okay. So he's sort of completely certain in the goodness and I often like to say that the more resourceful opposite of certainty is not uncertainty, it's possibility. You can't get people to unhook from certainties if their only choice is uncertainty. But you can get them to unhook from certainties if the other choice is possibility. So Erickson gets this on some levels. This is why he's playing that possibility frame. He's seeding that idea of possibility and also bringing that energy of curiosity into the mix and inviting the client into that space.
I think it's beautiful. I was reminded earlier when you were saying about a curiosity hook, and from years of my wife and I are filmmakers and pitching screenplay ideas to executives and producers. And there was a little gambit, I guess we would do, or a little bit of business, is I would say, oh, we have this, they were like, what ideas do you have? And it's like, oh, we have this story. And then I would kind of pause and be like, it's a little out there and it's probably not for you. So what do you have going on? And then they would be like, well, they would always immediately lean forward. Well, now you have to tell me about it, you know?
Right.
Yeah. And I loved it. And it didn't matter what it was. If I would employ that, they would always insist that I tell them.
Right.
I forgot about that. I just realized I used to do that before I learned any of this. And I was like, oh, it's a little curiosity hook.
It's super cool, that kind of thing. I've often said this about, I don't do this anymore, or extremely rarely do this, but I used to do a lot of street hypnosis. And the trick with street hypnosis is if you're going around and you're going, I'm desperate to hypnotize somebody, and you're trying to jump on somebody, and it's like, I want to hypnotize you. It's like, well, you want it more than they do.
Right.
So you're chasing them for it, right? And like, you know, when you chase people, they very often run away. So the trick is to get the person to sort of chase you with that exactly the kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, so I tell you what, we could, no, I probably shouldn't do that, you know?
Yeah.
And then they're coming back in and going, what? It's like, all right, okay, I shouldn't do this, but.
Right.
Right. So it's like, we shouldn't do this, but it's like, okay, well, we're going to do it. It's like, I'm kind of curious. It's just you build a little bit more of a dynamic and get the person chasing. And I think I maybe talked about this in the Hypnosis Without Trance book. Maybe, I don't know, about instead of jumping in, if you're in a conversation, seeding the idea that you're a hypnotist and then changing tack a bit. Instead of going, oh, I'm a hypnotist, and kind of carrying on along that line. It's just because it's an unusual thing. People don't meet people who say they're hypnotists. So if you say you're a hypnotist and then instead of explaining it, kind of tangentially move off somewhere else, they're like, he's a hypnotist. That loop is now open. And they kind of start to become curious about that and want to sort of chase you down a little bit more for it.
Can you think of any other little hooks or little gambits, or just to engendering curiosity in a client if you're feeling like they're not, or that would be useful?
One of my favorite ones, actually, is just this. So, and that will be delivered when the client has said something that I want them to be curious about that would normally zip by. People talk and they say, oh, this, that, and the other, and they just keep moving on. They keep moving on. They keep moving on. But if I want to shine that spotlight of attention or consciousness on that one little bit with a bit of energy of curiosity, when they hit the bit that I want to get the energy on, I'll just do that kind of like, yeah, and they're like, what? What's he seen? What's the significance?
It's implying a massive amount of significance.
Right.
Because in a daily conversation, if someone just suddenly went, yeah, I just realized that anyone who ever does that, you kind of lean in, you go, what's just happened? They have some huge insight. I want to know what it is.
Yeah. So you're implying significance, but you've not yet revealed the significance.
So that's hooking them in.
So there's that curiosity hook. What is it? I was reading this book. Maybe it was in Chip and Dan Heath's book, Made to Stick. I don't know. It may or may not be. Have you ever read that book?
I'm not familiar with that.
It's just about why certain things go viral and why other things don't. And there's an idea in there of the implied knowledge gap. I think that's what they call it. I don't think it's the best title, but you're implying to somebody that they have a crucial gap in their knowledge that they desperately want to, they're like, what is it? There's something missing here that I don't know. And then they want to close that gap. And this is how a lot of like viral video titles, like even something like, why you won't succeed in life until you change this.
Right.
It's like, what? Change what?
Right.
So there's the implied knowledge gap, and there's a hook and a motivation inside of it. So it's a similar principle.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you have to say about curiosity in general in the context of change work? Or
I don't think there really is. I do think it's a profoundly valuable resource. And if you can get curiosity into the session, which can come about from you being curious about things, sometimes questions like, so what do you love doing? Right? That's a genuine curiosity. But then once their love for that thing comes up, you can start finding the curiosity in their own energy mix and sort of drawing that out as well. Now, I'm a certain sort of person that by default, I'm not especially a people person, which someone might go, well, that's odd, James, because you're in a very people-focused kind of business, right?
Right.
Now, my interest is in minds and how they work in the abstract, not necessarily in people. So, and this is partly to do with the way I was raised. So the way I was raised was that it was basically rude to inquire into other people's lives and business. So you wanted to shut that down because you shouldn't pry into people's lives or their business. So I learned from a very young age to be uncurious about people and their lives. It was just a default, and I would never go there in social conversation particularly, and I'm probably still got some of that going on in the mix. Now, Lexi, my wife, she's always very curious about people. She's like, I say, oh, so-and-so's just got back from holiday. Oh, where did they go? I don't know. Didn't ask, right? But she'd be like, what? How could you not be interested in where they went on holiday? I don't know. I'm just not, right? Now, so for me, the horrible truth is that I confess right now is when I initially started doing change work, I was not curious about people. I was not interested in their lives and them. Right. So I thought to myself, I need to change this. I need to get interested in people. So I'm going to start developing this side of me that is curious about where people went on holiday and does care about those things. And I don't think that really worked for me. I think what worked for me is finding out what I was curious about people. Because it wasn't that I was uncurious about people. I was just uncurious about certain things that other people were curious about, like where somebody went on a holiday or what their favorite popcorn topping is or whatever. I don't know. But what I am interested in, I'm interested in how people make sense of the world, and I'm interested in what that creates for them in their experience. So I have a real interest in people's worldviews, not necessarily what they did last week or anything like that. So I find for me, the best way to get curious is to really connect with what I genuinely am curious about rather than trying to act curious about stuff I'm not curious about. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So extrapolate that out to a fake interaction with a client. How would you get curious about the part of the client that you are curious about, and what is the part you're not curious about? If that makes sense, that question.
Well, here's the thing. I'm not a gossip-driven person. So, and I'm not saying that this is what other therapists do, but I have encountered some changework practitioners and therapists who are kind of like, "Oh, that's interesting." Like someone was having an affair with somebody. I wonder what. I don't have that kind of soap opera interest in things.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of stuff that I won't necessarily ask about, even if it might be kind of salacious and interesting. It might be interesting if I were a novel writer and I wanted to get some ideas for like plot lines and things, but that's not what I'm there to do. So I might be interested in, I don't know, I'm interested in, say, the history of the problem or where it shows up, where it doesn't show up, because I'm interested in what's different in those occasions where it doesn't show up. Right. I might be interested in, does the problem have an origin? What happened at that time? Because I'm curious about what might have shifted in their semantic base at that point. What would the change in belief have been? Right. Or if somebody espouses a belief, particularly in an overt way, I might be curious as to the history of that belief. Where did it come from? Where did they get it from? How did they acquire it? These sorts of things. So I'm curious about that, and I'm curious about the places where we can nudge things and get change to happen and all of that kind of thing. So I'm intensely curious about stuff that most people are probably not really that curious about, but very uncurious about the things that probably a lot of people are curious about. But there are certain things that I'm always curious about people's developmental track in life. So I'll give an example of this, which has got nothing to do with change work. My brother, he was a TV producer. He arranged it so that my youngest daughter could go visit the set of a TV show they were making and see how things were done because she has an interest in filmmaking. So I had to go as a chaperone, which was not a bad thing because I'm fascinated by these things also, and I love that environment. And I got talking to the first assistant director. And I'm really curious about how everyone there got to be there. That I want to know. It's like you work in this, what is a really interesting area to me. And it's an unusual area. Most people don't work in TV production. Right. So I'm kind of really interested. How did you get into this? And I said to the director, I was genuinely interested. How did you get into this? And I said, well, how did you get this? He said, oh, I was a hairdresser. I'm like, what? He said, yeah, I was a hairdresser in Edinburgh. And when they filmed Train Spotting, there was just an advert out. They needed people to work on the cast's hair, and make sure it was right between shots and stuff. He said, I just love the environment so much that I just decided I wanted to work in this area. That's always interesting to me. Developmental tracks, these sorts of things. What kind of shifts needed to happen? What kind of ways of being in the world changed on the way?
What is interesting about that? If that's the part in a client session that you're curious about, that I don't know if you can describe what about that is interesting. Is it the problem solving? What is it to you?
So outside of a client session, I'm just interested in that because I love self-development and I love people finding their way through life and finding who they are and how they are. That's just something that's, in a sense, it's my primary interest. How do we live in the world? How do we create in the world? How do we engage with the world in a way that brings about good results for us and is resonant with our soul's code or whatever you want to call it, right? The thumbprint of our soul. That is, to me, endlessly fascinating because that, to me, is the challenge that we all face. We all come into the world going, huh? What? And the world we live in now is not the world we were evolved to live in. It's infinitely more complex and rich. So the challenges are far greater. So when people find their way in the world, develop themselves, find how they fit in, and it's a way that's rewarding and fulfilling to them and brings about good results, that I'm really interested in. I have a very, very deep interest in that. Now, so if I'm working with a client, One of the things that's a sort of influence on me, and I've got my reservations about it, it's a little bit culty and there's some of the underpinnings I don't agree with, but there's something called narrative therapy. I've got quite a lot of influence from. And narrative therapy recognizes that we make sense of our life through stories. Basically, we make sense of ourselves and our life through stories. Now, there isn't one story of our life. There's many stories. There are dominant stories and there are subordinate stories, and there are potential stories that haven't been told in the past material of our life. So, like when a client comes in and they're looking to change something, the problem usually sits within the context of a particular dominant story that doesn't contain the resources for the solution. But that doesn't mean they don't have the resources.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that if you connect somebody to a different story or narrative of their life, that they won't suddenly go, oh, I just do that and the problem's gone. You know, so like there's a relationship there with some of the solution focused stuff. I had a guy not that long ago. He was caught in a terrible situation that was terrible for him, where he was in an argument with his sisters about how his mother had been cared for, and it had ended up with a lot of bad blood, and he was desperate to get it resolved, and they didn't want to talk about it, and it was causing the guy so much upset. And it turned out that the guy was an engineer who was brilliant at solving problems and developing systems in the sort of computer world and all of that, which is alien to me. And I said, so how do you do that? You know, like, sounds like you're pretty good. So I just got him in the story of what a great engineer it was. And it's like, how did he approach these engineering problems? And I was just like, so how would it be if you had more of that in that situation? Ding, 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 ding. Off it all goes. Problem drops away. Because his relationship to the engineering problems and his way of being with that and his way of attending was entirely different and incredibly resourceful. But he just wasn't bringing it across to this different context. The reason I'm talking about this is because I'm saying I'm interested in people's stories of success, stories of where they adapted, where they changed, where they found a way through. Everyone has stories of success in various areas of their life. So I'm curious about those because those are often profoundly resourcing for clients who are looking to make change or they're stuck in a particular area. If you can draw out those narratives and be curious about those, they are significant resources often for people.
When I was laughing so much when you said people are born and they're like, huh? What? Because I'm laughing because I think people live their entire life from huh, what, and then die from huh, what, like often people do.
Right.
I have very close family members that are very old and have lived a completely unexamined life from my point of view.
Yeah.
And they're still doing huh, what.
Right.
It just makes me laugh.
Right.
It's like, I can just imagine their last gasp on their deathbed is going to be, huh, what? And then they die.
Well, you know, I used to tell a story about somebody that I knew when I was a kid, and they were often on the sofa drinking beer, watching TV in their boxer shorts. And then years later, when they were at the end of their life, they were still drinking beer, watching TV in their boxer shorts. I think some people are quite developmental. They do live that examined life. They do engage in self-change, self-development to varying levels of success. And other people appear to not do that much. I tend to operate by the presupposition that in some areas, at least, there has been development. There has been places where challenges were overcome, where thinking did change. So even when it seems to be, when someone's living in a dominant narrative, the main story arc is TV, beer, boxer shorts, sofa, right? That might seem to be the kind of dominant arc. But if those sort of subordinate stories that were enriching were brought to the fore, and the person were connected more fully into those, how much more of that would start to come out in their life? It's what you acknowledge, you know, what you actually take ownership of and you value and you bring into consciousness becomes generative and brings you more. So like the more you recognize goodness in your life, the more goodness you find coming your way. And the more you you go, oh, everything's crap, the more everything's crap comes your way. So I think if you can help people bring out narratives that make sense of them in the world in more empowering ways, then the more generative their engagement with the world becomes by default.
I'm doing everything I can to not stop laughing. I just immediately picked, when you said, huh, what? Like, I pictured a baby popping out. Going, oh,
Right.
What? Huh, what? Because everyone feels that at some point. Like, what the hell is this?
Right. But like a lot of the time, see, this is one of the things I often point out when I'm doing Changework or coaching. I say, you do know that you live in a completely fucked up and crazy world, right? And they go, oh, I'm like, we were not evolved to deal with all of this. So if you've been having a hard time with some of it, that's kind of understandable. So I often, this is another gambit. This is another, bit of business that I'll run on people, because people often feel that they're deficient because they're not handling life well, or they're handling the world well. And what they forget is we really evolved to sort of get up in the morning, scratch our butts, go pick some berries, collect some eggs, maybe spear a bison if we're lucky, and sit back down, make a fire, eat that, have a bit of chit chat, have some fun. We were not evolved for a massively complex life, but we've created this incredibly complex world that we now have to go, oh, how do I deal with all of this? If people find that a little bit challenging at times, they find that life gets on top of them, they haven't quite got it all figured out, I think it's more useful for them to recognize that that is not some personal deficiency. It really isn't. We're not meant for this. Now, I don't mean that in a kind of, it's not fair, we're not meant for this. I just mean that to honor there's a significant challenge in making our way in the modern world in ways that are enriching and rewarding and enjoyable and generative and generally good across the board. It's harder to find. I think the ancient Greeks used to talk about eudaimonia. Have you heard that term, eudaimonia?
Mm-mm.
So there's two types of goodness in a person. There's hedonia. Everyone's heard of a hedonist. Mm-hmm. And hedonia is like this pleasure in the moment. You could watch a sunset and really enjoy that sunset, or you could drink some wine and love that, or be having some great sex or something and whatever. And a lot of people chase hedonia, but there's this other quality which is eudaimonia, which is about a deeper satisfaction with life. It's not about a momentary pleasure or how good you feel right now. When I went to university, my ethics professor, Jerry Hughes, used to say it was more about happiness in a complete lifetime, sort of a lower key but a richer satisfaction rather than a passing pleasure. So kind of finding that eudaimonia in the modern world is much more challenging than it would be, I think, in a more kind of natural, sort of organic setting. And people are challenged by that. And that's one of the reasons why people get derailed. There's a lot of talk about a mental health crisis at the moment. I think a lot of it's just like, we're dealing with a really weird, artificial world.
So there you go. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. I know I did. I found myself laughing a lot in that one, and it was kind of fun to listen back to. If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach us here at changeworkingpod@gmail.com. Give us your thoughts, any feedback, ideas for episodes. And if you have any questions, we'll try to answer those on a future episode. See you next time.
Changeworking is produced by Ruckus Sky. For information on training, go to clientshifts.com.